You guys are ready?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome back to CSE's live chat. I'm Sukanya Nair and I have with me today CSE's climate policy researchers Avantika Goswami and Trishant Dev. Hi guys, thank you so much for joining. So a new era for the climate change has come as the United States has elected, or sorry, as Donald Trump is sworn in as the 47th president. And hours into his second term, he signed an executive order which is putting America first in international environmental agreements. Trishant, my first question to you is, what has Trump announced so far that is threatening to climate action?
Well, thank you, Sukanya. I think a new US government signing a record number of executive order means that the policy world, policy commentators and makers have a lot on their plate to think about now. Domestically, for the US, things start with an executive order signed by the administration that halts all federal funding under two key laws, the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, and the bipartisan infrastructure law. This means that loans, grants, and any other funding tied to these two laws that haven't been dispersed yet won't be dispersed until the pause is lifted. This puts about 50 billions in loans already agreed upon by the Department of Energy, along with another about $280 billion, which was under review. In risks. So a huge chunk of clean energy investment in the US has now come to an abrupt halt. The administration has also declared a national energy emergency. This means that possibly it would open up new federal lands for oil and gas exploration. The executive order titled Unleashing American Energy lifted restriction on oil and gas drilling in Alaska. He also ended pause on approval on liquefied natural gas exports, suspended offshore wind leasing, signed an order to end EV subsidies, and which, by the way, included tax credits for EV buyers and also federal support for charging infrastructure. Apart from this, globally, the highlight has been withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Uh, uh, this also means that any other commitment under the Paris Agreement won't be followed by the new administration. It has also revoked U.S. International Climate Finance Plan, which was signed by the Biden administration. All foreign aid that the US government was providing has been paused for a 90-day period pending a review. And finally, I think there's been a talk of a whole lot of tariffs that the US government wants to utilize as a tool for revenue generation, restricting foreign trade, and retaliatory measures against what the new government perceives as unfair trade practices by its partner countries. So this is, in a way, an overhauling of a structure that was either in place or was being built upon climate action within the US.
So the US pulling out of the Paris Accord, climate accord, has made news and for the right reasons. Avantika, my question to you is, how do multilateral discussions on climate change, such as the UNFCCC talks, how will they proceed now? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. And thanks for having us on here today. So yeah, that's a super important question. And the big news really is that the US is pulling out of the Paris Agreement, not for the first time, but for the second time. Trump did this when he was sworn in as the 45th president. So I can get to some of the details, but before that, if Trishant, you want to talk about what happened the last time that the US did this, there were some interesting nuances about the US's continued participation despite its stated intent to pull out.
Yeah, I think I can talk about it. The last time around when Trump quit the Paris Agreement, the US was never officially out of any of the COPs. because the US gave a formal notice of withdrawal in November 2019. And this was followed by a 1-year notice period when the US would have been formally out of Paris. But there was no COP in 2020, and by 2021, Biden was back, and Biden had signed an executive order which brought the US back into the Paris Agreement. So, but if you look at between 2017 and 2019, the US government actually continued to make statements at COP. And 2017 was a period when Trump came in. They said that the Trump administration intends to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because they feel that the Paris Agreement is detrimental to the American interests. And unless more favorable terms are identified and worked out, they would stay out of it. So the position was not to not have a climate agreement, but not to have one that supersedes basically the US national interest. Some of the states and city governments had also formed an alliance to continue to serve the objectives of the Paris Agreement at the sub-national level during that time. But I think now going forward, now that the US will be putting a formal notice to the UN, they will have 1-year notice period. So officially, they will be participating at COP30. As the new COP30 president, Andre Correa Dolago, has expressed concerns on US quitting the Paris Agreement. But he also said in the same comment that US remains a member of the UN Climate Convention. So there could be other avenues where US could engage in climate conversations. It is still unclear how the US will handle its new set of NDCs that the Biden administration had announced last month. So yeah, I think this is what we can read from the present situation on this.
Yeah, and I mean, the way forward for the UNFCCC in general, I want to highlight, is a little unclear, sorry, in terms of what the priorities will be this year. So until last year, there were very clear timelines for certain goals. So the new collective quantified goal on climate finance had to be negotiated by last year. So that finance commitment was made. It was a terrible deal. It was a really low commitment, but it was concluded last year. This year, we also kind of within the negotiations concluded the discussions on Article 6, although there are still many details to be hashed out. So it's a little unclear what the priority will be within the multilateral climate diplomacy space this year. There's a number of big issues, be it NDCs or the question of fossil fuel phase out, or the larger question of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement related to finance. But the point is that even if the US, I think as Trishant pointed out earlier, that the last time the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, it kind of continued to engage and was reinstated almost as soon as the official exit was becoming operational. But this time, after the 1-year grace period is done, the US will probably not be involved in the discussions, maybe for the first time, at least within the Paris Agreement's regime. And the point is, how much of a difference will this make in the negotiations? Well, in these spaces, to be honest, the US does not play the most constructive role. This is something that has to be made clear. It has been a blocker on multiple very, very clear concrete demands that developing countries have made. If you talk about climate finance commitments, the US provided something like 10% of the total climate finance by 21 Annex 2 countries between 2011 and 2020. Amounting to about $22 billion, an average of about $2.3 billion per year. You compare that 2.3 billion per year to the annual military budget of the US, which is like $700-800 billion. So it's not been a huge contributor to climate finance. Maybe on the finance question within the climate regime, a bigger question is the control that the US has over multilateral banks and the IMF. But that's also a little bit out of the purview of the UNFCCC. So the point is that within the UNFCCC, the absence of the US, it's going to be, I mean, it's not ideal, but the US doesn't play the most constructive role. I think simultaneously what it's going to be quite crucial is to strengthen various other multilateral spaces where developing countries do continue to have a voice, like the FFD Forum, the Financing for Development, or even BRICS as a space where large emerging economies are having a voice and furthering some parts of their agenda. It's important to note, however, that even if the US is not in the UNFCCC discussions on climate, in the global economy, it has an absolutely hegemonic major role, be it talking about controlling the dollar system, which is the currency used in most global trades, or wielding the largest military. The US has the biggest trade deficit as an economy. So in terms of just pure imports, the US is the biggest importer of goods. Its imports amount to something like $3 trillion. And the second in that list only is China, which is at 2.71 trillion. So it also has huge influence over the governance of the international financial institutions like the World Bank. It's the largest quota holder of SDRs within the IMF. Interestingly, it's also the biggest funder of the UN, owing something like 22% of funding to the UNFCCC, and it has veto power within the UN Security Council. So, I mean, US influence is everywhere. So, and the fact that any kind of climate action that needs to be furthered multilaterally requires all of these elements across the financial, trade, national, global security systems to kind of be conducive. I think the US role in all of those systems makes it a very large looming presence. So yeah, I think it's going to be difficult to completely ignore that impact.
So I think the big question is for today is it going to be business as usual for the rest of the world? Will everybody else proceed fighting climate change or will it slow down?
I mean, we've been thinking about this quite a bit within civil society, even among us within the organization and even in conversations. There's multiple likely scenarios. It's a bit difficult to predict. But if you assume that this is this new reality where the US is out of the Paris Agreement and it's not even participating in global decarbonization efforts, keeping this reality in mind, there could be maybe three plausible scenarios, and there could be more. But for the moment, let's assume there's three plausible scenarios. So the first could be that the US exit means that the rest of the world just completely regresses on climate action, and they say that we won't sacrifice our growth and energy security if the world's biggest historical polluter is not really taking the lead on climate. And we could have everybody backsliding. The BRICS, for example, in their last statement produced last year, really doubled down on this whole growth and energy security question, signaling their intent to really be fossil entrenched in the foreseeable future. The second scenario is where the rest of the world says, no, we need to move ahead on climate action. And maybe you could have players like the European Union and China at the helm of that. The EU being definitely more progressive on climate, and China being an absolute leader in the production and deployment of green technologies. In this scenario, you could assume that the rest of the world doesn't really think about holding the US sovereign state that accountable, but focuses on subnational actors, private sector enthusiasm, and also looks for other new leadership from across the global south. And this scenario could kind of operate on this pragmatic reality that, oh, the US is just contributing 13% of GHG emissions annually today. Most of the emissions growth is in Asia and the developing world. So let's focus there. Also globally, there's a lot of positive momentum on clean energy investment from the private sector. So let's kind of build on that. Let's forget about the US. So that's scenario two. The third is where the rest of the world really demands climate action, moves ahead on it, but also holds the US accountable and does not let it off the hook. This will involve actually building pressure, maybe some sort of sanctions or tariffs tied to emissions or inaction on climate, maybe a historical polluter tax. And this approach would be really rooted on the premise that the US is responsible for 25% of historical CO2 emissions, plus it's emitting even today. And it's also funding polluting activities around the world. Something like 64% of fossil fuel investors are based in the US. So this kind of a scenario where the world charges ahead on climate action, but also puts the US under pressure, we really need some very strong coalitions in the rest of the world, particularly amidst the global south. And this is where, again, forums like BRICS will have to really put their short-termism aside and think of how to leapfrog high carbon intensive development and switch over to green, climate resilient, low carbon development. So I think those are some of the possibilities. It's a bit uncertain given that we have seen a shift away from multilateralism and more towards, domestic self-interest recently. We've also seen kind of a focus on smaller coalitions, so friendly countries working with one another, or a focus on bilateral relations. This is not ideal because multilateralism is very crucial for global decarbonization, but that's really the tendency that we've been seeing. So it's really uncertain. Lastly, I think in terms of the US's own path, given that the announcements that Trump has made, if he goes through with unrelenting expansion of oil and gas, scaling away of removal of any kind of domestic decarbonization efforts, that's going to be a huge problem for US decarbonization. So if you look at the US emissions trajectory over the past decade or a little more than that, emissions have declined something like at a median annual rate of only 0.77% per year between 2010 and 2022. This is for annual gross emissions, not considering the land use sector. So emissions have kind of remained flat. There has not been a significant decline. There's been a marginal dip in transport sector emissions. The power sector has seen a bigger dip of about 11% between 2017 and 2022, Trump to Biden, mostly because of the replacement of coal with gas. The industry sector has seen a smaller dip of 3%, but other sectors like agriculture, residential, and commercial emissions have risen. So the point is that the US has put in place an NDC for 2030 and an NDC for 2035. But to really achieve those NDCs, it's going to need something like annual reductions of 5 to 7% per year of emissions, which is really not happening right now. So it's a huge problem that they are not on track and they are probably set to regress further.
All right. So, Trishant, my final question is for you. So, the self-proclaimed tariff man also has his sights on tariffs on trade, which could possibly hurt climate action. What are your thoughts on that?
I think tariffs have actually taken center stage in Donald Trump's recent media communications. And I think there is something to be read in those announcements. He has now threatened a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico. Now also said that there would be a 10% tariff on Chinese goods starting as early as in Feb. Earlier on his campaign trail, he had said that he wants to put a universal tariff on goods from all over the world of about 10% and about 60% on Chinese goods. So a lot of statements have been made. For the green transition, I think this could be tricky. I think for one, the US solar manufacturing and deployment would take a hit almost in the immediate circumstance of green goods being tariffs being applied on green goods because a lot of the raw material for solar manufacturing is sourced from Southeast Asia and South Asia. So this industry is going to be hit within the US. Two, if tariffs on green imports are applied, the overall cost of green transition within the US would actually increase. On the international side, countries like India, which have been stepping up as suppliers of green goods to the United States, actually there's a figure that exports from India of solar panels went up from about 2.5% in 2022 to about 10.7% in 2024. I mean, as a share of the US imports of solar PV modules. So countries like India might need to look into how they could sustain this kind of export growth and how they could look into other kinds of market to build onto the success that they have been able to manage in the recent years. And perhaps overall, it could further solidify the role of China in the global supply of green technologies It has already been a leading supplier, but a kind of receding America would all the more strengthen this role, strengthen more geopolitical influence of China when it comes to green trade.
Any last words, Avantika, before we close?
I think I think I can't remember who spoke about this recently, whether it was a few different commentators talked about how we are entering an era of radical uncertainty. And that's just honestly not just on the climate front, but on multiple different, on global economic policy, on the question of, the migrant crisis, on multiple different fronts. So Donald Trump is just another major element of uncertainty. And what is really going to be important is that everybody kind of doesn't panic, and we need to strategize, particularly among developing countries. Large developing countries like India can actually play a leadership role and prevent a global backsliding on climate action. Because as we know it, climate risks, climate impacts are already happening. Currently, Florida is seeing snow and ice like it has never experienced. So it's not just the poor world, but the rich world also that's being absolutely battered by erratic and unpredictable weather events. And these climate risks are going to hurt not just people and ecosystems and livelihoods, but also businesses and industries. So you're going to have some kind of major shaving off of GDP points for multiple countries under extreme scenarios of climate change. So we can't afford to backslide. And this is really where the rest of the world needs to step up and take leadership, because the US is just not going to be there for the next 4 years at the very least.
Trishant, any last words?
I think Avantika's words could
Has summed it up pretty well, yeah.
so
All right.
nothing to add.
Okay. Thank you so much, Avantika and Trishant, for sharing your valuable insights. It has been an engaging discussion, and I think we've covered everything from potential impact of Trump's decision on climate action and also the future of multilateral negotiations. So, thank you very much. And to everybody who joined us today, thank you for tuning in and being part of the conversation. If you have any more questions or thoughts, feel free to write to us or share in the comments, and we'll get back to you on that. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and together let's keep the dialogue on climate action going. See you at the next live chat. Bye bye.
Thank you.